Hey everyone, welcome back again to another GMAT Club live video. Today I'm here with one of our GMAT Club users who took the GMAT last week, almost just a week back. But before we jump into what happened, the GMAT in a test center during these times, I'm going to quickly go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Shovik. I'm a second year, no, I'm an alumnus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. You clearly know me because I've been doing these videos for a long time on the GMAT Club channel right now. But I want to introduce you, Texas, and why don't you just jump in and quickly tell us a little bit more about you, and then we'll dive into your GMAT experience.
Sure. So I'm Texas. I currently work in the
Why don't you just jump
in Houston. And like Shobik just said, I was able to recently sneak into a GMAT testing center and actually take the test in person versus online. Yep, that's me.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit more about that. Before we jump into your actual GMAT experience, tell me more about, when did you start preparing for the GMAT? When did the GMAT bug sort of hit you? Walk us through some of that journey.
So I've been considering a full-time MBA program for quite some time. So really the GMAT bug hit me, I would say, towards the beginning of this year in preparation for the 2023 cycle. So I really started seriously prepping right around Christmas, New Year time. And so I ended up taking my first test in February and doing okay on that test, but wanted to improve strictly on the quant side. And so I spent the last few months prepping strictly pretty much on quant, and was able to get in May. So it's been a whirlwind cycle, I would say. Prepping for the GMAT can be challenging, and there's obviously some things that come along with having some question marks about when you're going to be able to get into the test. And so one of the things I was really focusing on was I felt very prepared, so I wanted to try and get into a center as quickly as possible. So I've been monitoring all the testing sites and seeing which centers would be open. So, yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about the prep side. So you mentioned that you started thinking about the GMAT earlier in the year, right? Mm-hmm. So, and by the way, people who are watching, feel free to ask questions about his GMAT prep. So we definitely can talk a lot about that. But walk me through, there's a lot of GMAT prep companies out there, right? And I'm guessing when you started, you were trying to sort of research your way through. So walk me through some of that research. How did you go about figuring out how to really prep?
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that's interesting as you start to research GMAT prep companies is you'll find that different companies perhaps focus on different areas of getting you prepped for the test. Every company has a little bit of a different approach. One of the things and one of the areas for development for myself that I thought I really needed to work on was how to approach different quant sections. Mm-hmm. And one of the GMAT prepping companies that is not actually very well known is called ExamPal. I at least had a difficult time finding too much information out about it, but they focus on their real strength is really determining how to attack different problems and using different methods and approaches to get into a quant problem and find the most efficient way of solving it. And that was something that I thought could be extremely beneficial for me. So I ended up subscribing to that program, and it was a great overview of the different approaches and a great just kind of refresher course on brushing up on some quant skills like trig that you maybe haven't used in way too long. So from there, I completed that course, and I think that gave me a pretty good overview and got me into the space where I was feeling pretty comfortable. But I think in some extent, and it completely depends on what type of quant score you're shooting for.
Right.
Definitely get you to the 44, 45 level and get you pretty comfortable with the overview of quant, but then moving up into those next stages to try and get into the more advanced quant sections can be a little difficult. And so actually, after I took my first GMAT, I really kind of realized, while it was good enough, I scored a quant 44 on my first GMAT, and I felt comfortable with most of the theories, but getting more in depth into more of a mastery of the topics needed a different approach.
Right.
So I ended up using Manhattan Prep, and then most recently stumbled onto GMAT club tests as well, which was really essential in moving me from kind of the 48, 49 level into the 50s. So
Right. So let me just back up a little bit. So you said you took the GMAT the first time, right?
Mhm.
And was that also an in-person test, or when did you take that test?
so I took that in February. So yes, that was also an in-person test. I've been extremely adamant about avoiding the online GMAT as much as
Oh yeah.
possible. Yep, yep. So
So
yep,
then
that was the first one.
you took an in-person test after finishing the exam pal course where you were
Mhm.
feeling confident about your quant being in the high 40s. So that's pretty awesome. And you scored a Q 45, 46. So you wanted to improve on that and you stumbled upon Manhattan Prep. So tell me more about that process because that is also something a lot of people struggle with, right? So they create like a baseline of maybe Q46, Q47, Q48 even, and then it gets sort of harder to make a jump to a Q49 or a Q50. So tell me more about how you achieved that. And you mentioned Manhattan, you mentioned GMAT Club test. Would love to know in more details on how you made that happen.
Yeah, sure. So I think Manhattan, the one thing Manhattan Prep does extremely well is focus on time constraints and being able to accurately move through arithmetic. So it may not be conceptually the most challenging material. I felt at least consistently challenged to meet the test deadlines and be trying to hit 2 minutes average per quant question. Particularly on some of those problem solving questions were just absolutely brutal.
Right,
Um, so I used Manhattan Prep to really work on number one, my timing, and number two, make sure I was able to quickly move and accurately move through some of the different quant questions.
right,
And so it really helped me there. One of the things that I found unique about Manhattan Prep is that while there was definitely some difficult time constraints and some difficult arithmetic you needed to do, conceptually it may not have been quite as difficult as you would hope for. So there was a lot of steps to get to an answer, but usually those steps were relatively basic. You could be at a 46, 47, 48 quant and it could really help you on the timing, but to really get some of the like the number property questions, etc.
right.
Conceptually, I just don't think necessarily it was as advanced as it needs to be to move up into kind of the higher echelons of quant. So,
Right.
yeah, yep. So then I looked for a third product. So I'm probably unique in that I've used quite a different GMAT prep companies, but I ended up kind of researching what is going to be conceptually the most difficult problems out there and it seemed to be a relative consensus that the GMAT club tests would really stretch the boundaries of your conceptual understanding, and so I really focused in on GMAT club test, and that's really what moved me from the 49 to the 50, and then eventually the 51 on the test. So
Yeah, that just went well for you. Like he's a monster.
he is, yeah, good for him. I really want to know who he is, but he's
For me
incredible.
too. So one of the things that I sort of felt, and I sort of echo most of what you said, is that there's a difference between just like plainly hard math versus tricky math. So one of the things that I sort of keep telling people when I do sessions on the GMAT is that the GMAT is a lot more tricky. It's not really a math test, and a lot of so-called like hard problems in a lot of different prep companies focus on like straining your time and like just you mentioned like giving the problem so many different steps that it seems hard. But when you actually break down the steps, it's actually not a hard problem at all. The GMAT club tests, but also the harder questions on the GMAT are significantly more tricky, and you could maybe solve them in under 1 minute. But to actually figure out a plan of action, that's where sort of the problem is. And I think I got a lot of help on the GMAT club tests too. It seems like your experience was sort of in line.
Mhm. Absolutely, yep. And I think that was the major distinction between Manhattan Prep and the GMAT Club tests is just, like you mentioned, it was quote unquote, the difficulty level of the questions was more around the time it took you to get through the steps, right? So there may be 8 steps you needed to accomplish to get to the solution, but the GMAT Club tests were much more difficult to even come up with what you needed to do in the first place.
Exactly.
And that really helped me move into the higher levels of quant. So
That sounds awesome. So parallelly, I'm guessing you were much more confident about your verbal score. So it didn't seem like you cared about putting a lot of stress on the verbal prep. But I still want to know, what was your strategy for verbal? How much were you scoring, etc.?
Hmm. So verbal is an interesting one for me, and there's a few reasons. So when I came in, I guess my first test ever, basically, I mean, this was, maybe after 3 hours of studying and once you understand how a data sufficiency problem even is set up and works, right? I mean, so very basic level. I scored a 38 quant, 38 verbal, and that was my first quote unquote practice test I ever took. And so I felt pretty comfortable in the verbal space.
Mhm.
And so even just doing full length practice tests was essentially my prep for verbal. And after that first test, I have relatively yet to go below a 40 on verbal. And so I really didn't spend too much time studying for verbal at all. My entirety of quote unquote my studying was just in full length practice tests. Really just taking the verbal section, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to like the actual test day, right? So you had two options because you took the test in May. Your first test, I think in-person testing was the only option.
Mhm.
But I think in your second test, you had the option to do the GMAT online. Tell me more about that decision. Why didn't you do the GMAT online? And how did you actually manage to get to the test center in person?
Sure. So, so the decision to take the GMAT in person really all stemmed around from, I think, Manhattan added an online whiteboard dashboard that you could work with through your quant section, and
Right.
I've always been someone that needs to write to think, I guess, in some extent. So I felt extremely comfortable writing, notes, and it would actually help me solve, even how I needed to approach the problem. And my score went drastically down when I tried a online whiteboard. And I know there's quite a few people who have had, opposite experience where their online performance is very similar to their in-person, pen
Right.
and paper approach. But I was definitely not one of those people. So once I realized that the online GMAT to me didn't seem necessarily like it would be able to reflect how I felt my ability was specifically in the quant section,
Yeah.
uh, I really started looking at open test centers. And so I spent a lot of time on the online scheduling software to look for tests. I would consistently, for instance, I would maybe have a test booked out for 2 weeks and it would get canceled a week before. So it was a pretty frustrating experience trying to find open test centers. And I was very wary of booking a test outside of Houston, essentially, because I was very nervous about, having to travel somewhere. You get there,
Yeah.
right? You go to the test center and it's closed.
Oh, yeah.
So I was lucky in the fact that I think once a few of the test centers started opening up, for instance, Phoenix was one of the first locations to open up, and I actually have some family there as well. So I looked into booking a test in Phoenix and
Right.
turned into a little bit of a quote unquote a personal time as a journey out there to take the test. And basically the whole week prior, I would call the test center, "Hey, are you guys closed? Are you closed yet? Are you open? Test gonna happen, right?" And finally, I think the Thursday I took it on the 16th, so I guess the 14th. I got in touch with the test center, and the guy was kind of just like, yeah, it's gonna happen, so you're good to come. So there were a few challenges with taking the test in person.
Yeah.
Number one, you are required to wear some form of mask while in the test center. So for me at least, I spent the last few weeks practicing with a mask on, just because I wanted to simulate the testing environment as much as possible. As well as it does seem, and I don't know if this is a true policy of GMAC and Pearson VUE, but it definitely seemed like no one was sitting anywhere close to each other. So
Right.
there was social distancing in the test centers as well as a ton of hand sanitizer, et cetera, all throughout the testing center. So it was a little bit of a strange experience, but well worth it in my mind to try and avoid the online GMAT test. So.
So for the mask, so you had to bring a mask from home, or were they giving you a mask at the center?
So they emailed you about 6 times before the test, making sure you understood the policy, and they said there's absolutely no way that they will provide a mask. it seemed that everyone in the testing center had on a surgical mask or an N95, but they did, it did seem to, it was worded somewhat vaguely in that it seemed to be something that would cover your nose and mouth.
Right.
So I'm not sure, right, if a bandana or something like that would qualify, but it was explicitly stated that you needed to provide your own mask. Yep.
So what kind of mask were you wearing?
I wore a surgical mask because I felt it was the most comfortable and I didn't get too hot with it. So.
Oh yeah, because I mean, I wore an N95 when I was traveling from Michigan to Florida, and that sort of felt like oxygen deprivation. Like that felt I could burn 50% more calories if I just stepped onto a treadmill. So
Maybe we should use that for exercise.
yes. So I felt that wearing the mask and taking the test would make the test very uncomfortable. By the way, I took the GMAT online like a couple of weeks back. So I took the second day, like I think April 20th is when it launched. I took the test on April 21st. And I think one of the things that I was sort of, pros and conning the whole thing, that if I would take in a test center, first of all, I have to travel. Like you were able to find the test center that was sort of close to you where your family was and all of that stuff. But for me, I was like, okay, I have to travel somewhere. I have to make sure I wear a mask. I have to make sure that, like I can breathe while taking the test, versus I sort of practice how to do things in my head and take the test online and see what happens. So I took the test just for fun, and I felt like it wasn't as bad because you sort of use a text tool at all. But at the same time, it definitely felt like I constantly had a handicap. It felt I guessed and moved on in at least 3 questions or 2, and that wouldn't happen in a test center. I would be able to actually put things to paper and be able to solve some of the questions.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I can think of at least 4 questions that I had that I would have, in my mind at least, absolutely no way would have been able to solve on the online formatting.
Yeah.
And so I feel pretty strongly about the fact that if you are shooting for kind of a top type of score, that in my mind I think it would be much easier to, not that to say that it can't be done, but
Right.
I think it would be much easier to score in an actual test center personally. So yeah.
So now you move to the final couple of minutes, and then we're going to start taking some questions. So feel free to put your questions in. By the way, if you're watching, if someone is sort of in the same shoes, right? Let's say they're mostly done with the GMAT prep and they're ready to like pull the trigger. So technically, the GMAT online is supposed to end in a few days, early June. So, but there's a high possibility that it will be extended because, like a lot of tests are, a lot of states are still closed, right? They haven't opened yet. Washington, for example. So they may have some of those restrictions. So what would your advice be to those people? Should they travel to a new place? Should they try to hack the GMAT online? What would you say?
So I think it's definitely going to, come down to the person as far as their comfort level with traveling, et cetera. So I live alone. I was able to come back and self-quarantine. So I think it definitely matters your comfort level and for instance, your home situation. But for me, at least, I think absolutely, in my mind, it was whatever I needed to do to be able to take the test in person, because I felt that I would have the highest probability or highest chance of scoring a score that I wanted to get right. So I personally feel that the online GMAT can be a little bit detrimental, specifically on the quant. But that also may be, depending on your personality, that may also be, taking the test from the comfort of your home may be something that will help you. So I think it's very dependent on the person. For me, at least, I know there was absolutely no way that I was interested in taking the GMAT online test. So I knew I was going to find a way to take the test in person. So
awesome. So I wanted to kill the suspense. Can you tell us your score?
You broke up a little bit there. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Can you tell us what you scored on the GMAT?
Sure. So I scored a 740 with a quant 51 and a verbal 40 split. So
awesome. That's a fantastic score, and I think that will probably get you to whichever school you want to get into. So So before we jump into the questions, I just wanted to ask one quick logistical thing. So when you were in the test center, what was your experience with the scratch pad? Did they have to wipe it down? Was it the same process as February when you did it the first time? The second one was you mentioned social distancing in the test center. How was that in terms of like the processes, like signing documents or the electronic signature or the palm scan? Was there anything different about the test center?
So for I'll address the first part. So for the scratch pad and the pens, the proctor was very adamant about the fact that they had just been cleaned before use and that they were wiping down with disinfectant pads between any person taking the test. So for the second, as far as the check-in and the paperwork, the first thing I noticed in comparison to my test in February was just the lack of people.
Right.
There was just so many fewer people in the testing center. And again, I don't know if that's actually a GMAC policy or if it just happened to be that there were less people in the testing center that day, but it definitely felt much less people than usual, as well as the waiting area. The chairs were spread out, et cetera. And then for the palm scanner and everything, there was a Purell there for you to, and they were adamant about cleansing your hands before touching the palm scanner, et cetera. So.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to take some questions from our audience, right? We are sort of at the end of the session. We have about 6 to 7 minutes. So a question about seeing variance from your practice test versus your real thing. So how much variation did you see between your GMAT scores when you're taking GMAT Prep versus the real deal? So what would be your answer for that?
Yeah, so I can say confidently on the quant, at least, I had scored, I would say, between a 49 and a 50 on the GMAT online scores. So slight variation. I actually felt that the quant was extremely manageable on the actual GMAT test.
Right.
A few questions that were quite difficult, but I felt that my quant score was pretty much in line on the verbal, and I don't know if this was just the fact that I didn't spend much time on it, but my verbal score plummeted in comparison to my traditional verbal score.
Right.
So I would say about 3 to 4 points lower than my average verbal score on the GMAT practice test online.
Awesome. And did you manage to get an ESR for your test?
Yes, I did get an ESR. Yeah.
So do you know which section was the reason that your verbal score sort of dropped, or was it all across the board?
So in comparison, relatively all across the board. Critical reasoning, I have traditionally never usually missed a question on that, as well as reading comprehension. And I was in the 86th percentile, I believe, for both of those this time. So missed one or two questions in those sections.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. So quick feedback on IR. So how did you prep for IR? And like IR sort of was like not a thing in the past, but now I think slowly it's sort of becoming its own thing. So how did you go about prepping for IR?
So I used the Manhattan IR prep,
Right.
and I felt very comfortable with that, and it seemed to actually be more difficult than IR on the test itself. And I think that the online GMAT prep tests are by far the most accurate at IR, but I also feel like Manhattan is more difficult. And the reason I say that, for me, at least for IR, I think that's basically a combination of verbal and quant. You have to be able to synthesize, verbal data as well as some numbers. And so if you're pretty comfortable in both of those spaces, the Manhattan will traditionally be more difficult than what you'd see on the actual GMAT test.
Got it. I have a theory that a couple years back, like 4 or 5 years back, IR used to be a lot more difficult. And I think when I was taking the test, this was back in 2017, 2016. Feels like forever back right now. But the IR used to be like something that that you'd have to like leave a couple questions, do your best. But I think now, like I took the GMAT a couple days back, like multiple times, and IR was pretty easy. It was like just like very basic data comprehension. But anyway, maybe I'm just getting better because of my business school training. Okay, question about the lockers, like, and snacks and drinks. Did you see any changes? Were you snacking in your break during the test?
Yeah, so I snacked and brought in water bottle, Gatorade, etc. That was the one area that I would say remained somewhat unchanged. So, it was the same procedure as always, select a locker. I didn't notice anything different from my test in February and the test more recently in May.
Right. So, question around the differences between the official guides and the GMAT Prep versus the actual GMAT. Did you see any difference, or would you say they are pretty similar and in sync with levels of difficulty and such?
So I think, and this is difficult for me to answer. And the reason I say that is, right, I've only really experienced the official GMAT questions a few times, right? So, it's not, I don't have necessarily a large data set to compare them, but I did feel that my overall trend, in my personal opinion, is that the GMAT prep and the official guide questions tend to be easier for verbal than
Right.
the real GMAT, and that the quant questions on the real GMAT tend to be easier than the official guide questions. And I don't know if there's other people that share that opinion, but that's just my personal opinion. So
I feel similarly. I feel like the official guide questions on the quant, it's like it's scaffolded, right? So the questions at the beginning are easy, and the moves to more difficult questions. I felt the official guide questions for quant at least did not have many difficult questions, but also at that time, like I was doing Buñuel sets, so like I was having PTSD from Buñuel's questions. So anything that was not designed by him, I felt like okay, I can take it. But for verbal, I totally agree. I think the GMAT verbal is, and especially if you're testing above like the 38, 39 level, they throw a lot of difficult questions at you. So I don't know. I think there are like, if you really scavenge through the forums, there are like some really, really challenging GMAT prep questions, but they are sort of, and official guide questions. But that only happens when you look at 3 or 4 official guides together to actually get a sizable bank of difficult questions. But if you're looking at just one official guide, the number of difficult questions in that may not be that great. So I don't know.
I completely agree with that, especially on the GMAT prep tests. At least my most recent prep test, right before I went into the test center, I actually missed one question on verbal. And I felt that most of the questions on that test were frankly pretty easy, right? And so I scored a 49 on that test for verbal, right? And then dropped substantially on the official GMAT. And I think that's really a function of receiving much more an average difficulty of much more difficult on the official GMAT versus the practice test. So.
Did you feel like you had seen some of those GMAT prep questions because you were such an active member on GMAT Club?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. That may be a part of it as well. Yep.
Yeah. Awesome. So this was great. We're sort of out of time, so I'll have to take your leave. Thank you so much for spending time with us, Texas. This was awesome. And I know that you're applying to school, so all the best for that. Like once your application journey is over, would love to have you back and, like learn a little bit from that experience as well. For everybody who's watching, we do videos almost every day now. So please like the video if you think this was helpful. That helps the YouTube algorithms is to sort of get more people onto the channel, which helps us. Subscribe to the channel if you want to get notified for future videos. But this was basically it, Texas. Any last thoughts for people who are taking the GMAT next week or the week after?
I don't think so. Other than maybe if you're taking it in person, definitely practice with the mask on would be my guidance. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for patiently answering all of our questions. And all the best for the application journey. And please reach out if you need any help. We'd be happy to get behind you.
All right. Appreciate it, Shobik. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.